My story really begins in high school. In high school, I was really a math science student, and I spent a lot of time in science and math courses, and I wasn't really all that interested in English and history. I did them and I did well. But there was a course in the spring of 1971, I graduated from high school in 1971, taught by Alan Stockett, a teacher who changed my life. And in that course, we read almost a novel a week throughout the year. And there was a book assigned, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And we had 2 weeks to read it, and I had put it off until the Sunday before the test was due on a Monday. And I remember very clearly on a Sunday afternoon at about 2:30 picking up the book, thinking I better read this. And I sat down and started to read it. And I couldn't put it down. And I was up all night. It's the first time I stayed up all night to read a book. And I was completely engrossed in a way I'd never ever been in reading a book. And the next morning as I finished it, I was just a different person. And it's hard to say now what the difference was, but I can say that what Dostoevsky was doing was completely new to me. I'd never read a book that was about what it means to have a character falling apart and trying to reassemble himself with all the other characters in the novel, trying to find himself in these relationships, trying to figure out a way to overcome the great crime in his life. He commits 2 murders in the book. And he's led to a kind of redemption through his love of Sonia, one of the women. After I read that, I realized that for the first time, books can change people's lives, not just entertain them, or distract them, or amuse them. That there was something going on in this book that was different from any other book I'd read. So when I went off to college, I still was sort of science, math student in many ways, but I started taking courses in literature and anthropology and history, and more I realized I belonged to the humanities in ways, and I'll explain that in a second about what I mean. But there was another teacher in another course in my senior year again, this at Amherst College, taught by Barry O'Connell. And that course really did change my life. It was called American Culture in Depression and War. And it was a survey of life and culture in America in the 1930s and ending with World War II. But it wasn't just a course about books. It was also a course about photographs. The government's Farm Security Administration photographers who took many pictures of migrant workers in the Southwest, Southeast. So we had to look at photographs and watch films every week, read novels, read essays, newspaper reports. And there was one book in particular, actually I should say 2 books in particular in that course, that in a way I've never stopped reading. And the first one was Absalom, Absolom by William Faulkner. I think it's the greatest American novel, the greatest novel an American has written. And the second is a different book. It's called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men by James Agee. And Agee's book was not like anything I'd read before. It was a direct challenge to the reader about who are you to look into the lives of the people that I'm writing about. And in this book, you're forced to flip back and forth between Agee's narrative and the photographs of Walker Evans that he's taken of real people living in the South in the Depression. People trying to make sense out of their lives, trying to keep their dignity, trying to survive, trying to understand what it means to live their lives in America. This book was so astounding that I realized then that I could retire a kind of pedestrian interest in literature. Agee required it. You couldn't come to the book as a pedestrian. You had to come to the book in a way that you were going to participate and enter the lives of the people he was talking about. And that was new to me. It was a way of getting me to think about how literature works, how it's related to the real world, and how the photographs of real people in this book can change the way you look at the world. So from that moment, I realized that the reductions of science and math, although interesting, were not nearly as interesting as the complexities and subtleties of literature and art. And I began to move very directly and quickly, deeply into the world of languages and literature and history. And it brought me around eventually, years later, to a tour at a museum where there was a Rembrandt exhibition. And there was a painting, I'll never forget it, that Rembrandt did of an older woman. She must be 68 years old. But what's revealing about this incredible painting are the eyes of the woman. And as you look at this portrait that Rembrandt did, one sees that in her eyes, in her gaze, there's an entire lifetime gathered up, reflected upon, and given back to the viewer. It stopped me in my tracks. I'd never seen such a look on the face of a portrait in a painting. And as I thought more and more about this painting, it's been with me a lot. I keep a reproduction of it in my office. I look at it often. It reminds me that in living a life and connecting to other people, there's nothing pedestrian about it. And the other way to think about this, as I began to think about it, it made me, I think, a better teacher. It made me a better pastor. I could listen to people talk about their problems more carefully, with more compassion, with more empathy. And it reminded me of what it is that we are really looking at when we look at a human face, in the face of a student, in the face of a family member, in the face of a stranger. How is it that we recognize and understand what's before us? And I thought about the portraits taken by Richard Avedon, the famous New York fashion photographer. And you may remember that anyone famous who came to New York in the late 50s and early 60s wanted to have their portrait taken by Avedon. And so everyone showed up. The Duke of Windsor and his wife came, Marilyn Monroe came, Andy Warhol came, the Rolling Stones came. And Avedon took portraits of them all. And just before they were to pose, to strike the pose for the photograph, Avedon realized that he would wait for a moment, unposed, snap the picture, and capture who he saw. And those portraits that Avedon took remind me a lot of Rembrandt's portraits. And there's one of Marilyn Monroe that's sort of devastatingly and hauntingly accurate. And if you take a look at the picture, you'll see that she's completely vacant in this stare. There is no reflection back in the eyes of this young woman as she looks into the camera. She's waiting to turn back into Marilyn Monroe, which she'll do in the next pose. And as soon as she's posing, she is no longer whoever the woman was who became Marilyn Monroe. She's become Marilyn Monroe. And if you look at the portraits that he took of the Duke of Windsor and his wife, you'll see a lifetime of expense in the eyes and faces of these two. They gave up a lot to do what they wanted to do. And the decisions of living that life are reflected in their faces. And I realized that photography is just deeply searching in its ability to reflect back a portrait, not of a face, but of a human soul. And these pictures, the other one is of William Cosby, at that time, 1959, one of the oldest living slaves, U.S. slaves left alive. And Avedon took this picture. It's just absolutely astounding. So there's a way in which, as I think back about these, as I relate to people, as I teach and relate to students, I think about what I learned from reading James Agee. I think about the teachers I've had in the past, Alan Stockett, Barry O'Connell, how they changed my life by putting in front of me books that made demands upon me. And that demand was to participate, to leave behind my defenses, and to be vulnerable to what it was they were about to show me and to tell me.